Hey, what's up? Welcome back to another Coffee and Current Events update about the Ukraine war. Today I have some very interesting news for you, and there's a lot of crazy stuff going on in and all over Ukraine. So without further ado, let's start. First, we're going to start on the Zaporozhye front. There have been some major developments all over Zaporozhye. I think almost everybody has heard the fact that Ukraine has started its major counteroffensive. The counteroffensive has been talked about for months, and they've been focusing their counteroffensive on two major areas in Zaporozhye. And in Zaporozhye, they've been focusing their counteroffensive on two major areas, Orhiv right here and right here near Velika Novosilica. First, we're going to start with Orhiv. This area was one of the first areas Ukraine launched its counteroffensive from. And at first, the Ukrainians launched it with the goal of probing Russian defenses. In fact, I still don't think we've seen the major push of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. I think a lot of these attacks are significant and they're serious, but they're mainly to probe the Russian defenses. And the Ukrainians pushed hard in the area of Lipkove, so that was where the major push of the Ukrainian counteroffensive was going. And it was intense combat. This is when we begin to see pictures of Western equipment destroyed, like M2 Bradleys, Leopard tanks. It was around this area. It may have not been exactly in Lipkove, but it was around this area near Orhiv. There's a joke going on in the Russian camp, and they're calling some areas around the Orhiv sector Bradley Square. It's kind of a runoff off Red Square. They're just calling it Bradley Square because so many Bradley vehicles have been destroyed there. And because Ukraine has been so serious about keeping operational silence, and they've been strict on enforcing operational silence about their counteroffensive, the Russians took advantage of this and took control of the information space temporarily. I mean, like right when the counteroffensive started, social media was flooded with pictures of destroyed Leopard tanks, destroyed Bradleys, etc., because the Ukrainians had left an information vacuum and the Russians took advantage of that. But many people failed to neglect the actual progress taking place on the battlefield for Ukraine. And we'll discuss that, but first I'm going to go over here to Velika Novosilica. And this is where the Ukrainians have made the most progress. Now, it wasn't easy. The Ukrainians had pushed attacks from the Velika Novosilica sector for quite a while, and the Russians continued to counterattack and retake the territory Ukraine took. Russia is currently practicing what's known as defense in depth. So let me explain to you what defense in depth is. Defense in depth is where an army has multiple lines of defense. In this case, it would be Russia. So Russia has multiple lines of defense all over the Zaporozhye Oblast. Now, the first line of defense is not heavily fortified, and it usually consists of soldiers with anti-tank weapons, maybe some drones, and these soldiers in the first line of defense heavily rely on mines. Well, when these soldiers are confronted by Ukrainian armored columns, they don't really have much to offer as significant resistance, so they fall back to the second line of Russian defenses. However, before they fall back, the Russian soldiers in the first line do their best to inflict heavy casualties on the Ukrainians and slow the Ukrainian offensive down. In other words, the first line of defense serves almost as a tripwire line. They attrit the attacking forces, in this case it would be the Ukrainians. They're attriting the Ukrainian forces as the Ukrainians press their offensive, and then they retreat back to the second line of defense. The second line of defense is a lot more heavily guarded, and the second line of defense has the Russian reserve. So after the first line of defense, having attrited the attacking Ukrainians, in many cases heavily, retreats, the second line of defense, which has a lot of Russian reserves and has very good defenses, the reserves from the second line launch a counterattack and retake most, if not all, the territory Ukraine just took. This defense in-depth strategy can be very effective. It forces your opponent to expend much resources and manpower in order to advance. When they do advance, your opponent is exhausted and needs time to consolidate their gains. But before they can, the second line of defense attacks and drives them back out. That's one of the reasons during the first days of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, you saw Twitter posts and a bunch of other posts on social media about Ukrainian gains. In reality, these were only temporary gains until the second line of Russian defense attacked and recaptured the territory. So now that I've addressed Russia's strategy in this counteroffensive, we want to talk about the main sectors Ukraine has made gains in. So back to Orhiv, the Ukrainians have made gains in this sector, albeit not substantial gains. They've pushed into the village of Lipkove right here. Lipkove has changed hands multiple times during this counteroffensive. The Ukrainians have taken the town, the Russians have stormed and recaptured it. The Ukrainians have launched their own offensive, retaking the town. The town of Lipkove was in the gray zone for a while, meaning it was contested, heavily contested. Although now, according to the Deep State map, it is in the blue zone, which according to Deep State means it's under Ukrainian control. And according to multiple reports, Lipkove does seem to be under Ukrainian control. So the Ukrainians did make gains here, albeit not massive ones. Now, near Velika Novosilica, that's where the Ukrainian gains were much more substantial. When this Ukrainian offensive first started, it kind of ran into the ground. At least that's the way it seemed. As I said, the Ukrainian silence left a vacuum in the information space, and the Russians took advantage of that for propaganda purposes. And so it seemed as if the Ukrainians were making practically no gains for high cost. And in some cases that was true, but in others it wasn't. Near the Velika Novosilica area, Ukraine actually has made some significant gains. They may not look significant on the map, but I'll explain why they are. To the west west of Rivne-Pil, Ukrainian forces have seemed to capture Novodorivka, and they have likely captured most, if not all, of Lavadne, meaning the Ukrainians have taken at least 2 settlements in this area. Directly south of Velika Novosilica, the Ukrainians have made more progress. The Ukrainians have captured the towns of Neskushne, Starozheve, Blahadne, and Makarivka. According to the map, it seems as if all 4 of these towns have been captured by the Ukrainians. And although these gains may not look significant on the map compared to the losses Ukraine has taken, let me explain why these are indeed significant gains. Now, I'm going to use a distance measurement device on Deep State to show you the problems with the Russian military. I'm going to be using these things as arrows. So, as you can see, Rivne-Pil is kind of a salient, and the Russian forces there are facing an operational encirclement. Let me explain how. If Ukrainian forces drive from Makarivka through here, and the forces from Novodorivka also attack through here, they can potentially trap Russian forces in Rivne-Pil in a salient, or give the appearance that they are going to trap them. This is either going to force the Russian forces to stay and get trapped, or withdraw, if the Ukrainian plan is carried out successfully. As you can see, the gains may look small, but they can turn into something very significant, and they can also turn into a very great crisis for the Russian high command if the Russians don't act and counterattack fast. Now, according to multiple updates, Russians have launched a counterattack near the Makarivka area. As I explained, their strategy is basically defense in depth, and most likely the second line of defense has launched some kind of counterattack. But the counterattack doesn't seem to be going super well. I mean, according to some reports, they have retaken some ground near or in Makarivka, but they haven't captured the entire town, and if the Ukrainians are able to consolidate these gains, we could see the first collapse of a Russian salient in this offensive. So the Russians need to act fast, or they could be in significant trouble. Now let's go to Avdiivka. There have been reports of Ukrainian counteroffensive operations in Avdiivka, and that is very important. In case you guys didn't know, the line around Donetsk City right here in Avdiivka has remained almost consistently stable in the front line. The Russian forces have not made significant gains, the Ukrainian forces have not made significant gains. But here's why this is so important. If you look right here, you see Donetsk City. This is the capital of the self-proclaimed dubious Donetsk People's Republic, which was formerly annexed by Russia in September 2022. If the Ukrainians were to recapture this city, it would be a significant PR blow for the Russians, because this city, Donetsk, is one of the most, if not the most important city in the entirety of the Donbass, and the Donbass, per the Russian authorities, the Donbass is the main reason for the fight in Ukraine. So losing Donetsk will be a significant setback to one of their major goals, which is quote-unquote to liberate the Donbass. Now, I will say this, despite the fact that the Ukrainians have launched counteroffensive operations in this area, this line has literally remained almost the same since the beginning of the conflict. So I don't think the Ukrainians will be having any significant breakthroughs unless they take their main reserve forces, I'm talking about the 50 to 60,000 men trained in the west, and attack here. Then we may see some gains, but aside from that, I don't think we're going to see any major Ukrainian gains here. Now let's talk about Bakhmut. The much celebrated Russian victory at Bakhmut was short-lived, because the Ukrainians almost immediately began counteroffensive operations. And as you can see, the Russians do control like 99% of the city. The problem is not the city itself, the problem is its flanks. The Ukrainians have made major gains near the north and south of Bakhmut. That'll be a significant issue. Let me show you why. I'm using measurement stick again, so once again, don't pay attention to kilometers. If the Ukrainians take full control of Berivka and they push east to Yahidne, okay, you can already see how the Russians in Bakhmut will feel like they're in a pincer maneuver, okay? If the Ukrainians are able to take full control of Berivka and push to Yahidne, they will significantly amp up the chances of Russian forces being encircled in Bakhmut. But more importantly, they will give the impression that Russian forces are near encirclement in Bakhmut, possibly prompting panic in the Russian lines. As we've seen throughout history, militaries that think they're surrounded either do 2 things: fight to the death or surrender. And I don't think Putin's down with figuring out which of the 2 options his forces would take in the case of a potential encirclement. Also to the south, the Ukrainians have made gains near Ivanivske. Once again, I'm going to use a measurement stick to show the potential for an encirclement near Bakhmut. If the Ukrainians push to Ivanivske, push from their gains right here, take Klachivka, you can see once again how this looks like an operational encirclement. Because if they have gains Yahidne and Klachivka, the Russian forces are going to be very near a tactical encirclement, and that's not going to be good. So the Russians have to hold Berkivka at all costs, or else there's going to be serious problems from that. So that's pretty much the major updates from the Ukrainian counteroffensive. As I discussed previously, there have been multiple Leopard tanks and multiple M2 Bradleys lost. I'll probably discuss that in another video, but I just wanted to give you a brief rundown of what's going on all over the front line. Be sure to subscribe for more updates like this. God bless you. Subscribe to Coffee and Current Events, and I'll catch you next time.